Hello, humans. Did I want to start a series of, I think, three videos about acupuncture, moxa, bleeding, and so forth in ancient times, and what that looked like. I've always been fascinated by, what would a clinic have looked like? How would they treat, and so forth. I want to see it visually, so you can watch some Chinese movies or something like that. But I also kind of like to research into this and then visualize it. So this picture is a needle case to carry needles around with you. And so the needles are inserted into this pad and then it's folded together and put in a little envelope. Anyway, so in ancient times, acupuncture needles were much larger gauge than they are today. Um, there are some reasons for this. For example, they weren't using guide tubes. You need a thicker needle to insert when you don't have a guide tube when you're doing freehand. Also, if you have a reusable needle that you're going to use again and again and again, a thicker needle will probably last longer without bending or breaking. And also, I don't know, this probably isn't true, but it's also possible that they didn't have the skill to make really fine wire to make very fine needles. Um, on the other hand, at least Chinese style tends to feel that you need a certain amount of sensation for acupuncture to be effective. Now, there are other schools of thought, especially like Japanese needling has a reputation for being much less sensation. But of course, we're talking about modern Japanese techniques. And here I'm talking about ancient Chinese techniques. So it's still true that, doctors in the real Chinese style tend to make strong chi sensation and use thicker needles than Japanese styles. But in any case, that's one thing, is the needles had a larger gauge. And here's some pictures from the Wellcome collection in England. And, these may be fancy needles. It's really kind of hard to tell if these are everyday needles or if these are special purpose. Of course, this one that looks like an arrow must be for lancing something. This one these look pretty thick. Um, the heads look heavy. So when you insert the needle, if you don't insert it very deeply, it's going to fall over when it has a heavier, handle to the needle. So that's something we're going to need to talk about. Here's some other needles from the Wellcome collection. They're not sure where they're from, China or Japan, 1800s. And the handle is pretty small, but the needle also looks kind of thick, although it's hard to tell. Here's a set of needles with a bamboo case. So you could put the needles inside to carry around. Maybe you can see right here, there's a cap for this case. You can see a little line there. So you put the needles in and close the cap, and then you can carry them around. And it's even more secure than the cloth case that we saw in the beginning because well, it looks like there's another line there. Maybe that's just a node. Of course, there's the node is at the bottom, so the needles won't fall out. Anyway, you can carry these around and they won't get bent and they won't accidentally stick through the cloth and stick you. And some of these look, a lot thicker than others. Seems like in making this display, they have two short ones, one thick, one thin, two slightly longer ones, one thick, one thin, and so forth. These handles look more like our modern handles, nothing fancy. Um, okay, so those are just some ancient needles. We don't know how old these are. These might be early 20th century, for all we know. So One of the characteristics of acupuncture, according to all the old books, is that they seem to really use many fewer points. I see people who insert 20 needles in a treatment. I think that's way too much. But even if you only insert 12, that's a lot. 8 is getting closer to what I think is a good amount. But it seems like they may have even used fewer needles than that. Ancient acupuncture texts gave point prescriptions. And so one way we can kind of start thinking about how many needles did they use is how many points were in a point prescription. Most of these point prescriptions had 2 or 3 points in combination. Um, like heart 7 and spleen 6, or LI4, LI11, and do 14, something like that, which would have like 4 or 5 needles between the points that were listed. Occasionally, really pretty rarely, you come across a 7-point combination. That's really large. That could be up to 14 needles, although it might be fewer if some of them are Du or Ren points. That's really odd to see that kind of combination in the old books. These combinations seem to be complete treatments and not just parts of a larger treatment. So, from the way they wrote, it seems like, 4 needles if it's a 2-point combination, 5 or 6 needles if it's a 3-point combination. That seems to be the most common thing. And then another way we can speculate on this is by looking at case studies and see how many points they use in acupuncture case studies. And, I've translated acupuncture case studies from Daang and from Bian Chui Xin Shu and from Jishen Fang and from, various books. And the cases all use very few needles, very few points, and very few needles. So one of the things then to consider about this is, acupuncture must have been effective or they wouldn't have kept doing it. And it must have been effective with fewer needles and fewer points. But remember, they have a larger gauge of the needles, so each needle would give stronger stimulation. And they tended to use hand techniques to give more strong stimulation. And also, they really emphasized the intent or the focus of the practitioner. And so other factors may add to the efficacy that we don't tend to have as much today. So let's look at a case from Zhenzhou Dacheng, which is this really famous Ming Dynasty book by Yang Jizhou. And, it's obviously an acupuncture moxa book. Zhenzhou is acumoxa. So it was published in 1601, relatively near the end of the Ming Dynasty. And he has, I forget how many cases, about 25 or 30 cases in it of his own cases. And so here's one of them. In Yimao year, which is 1555, Yang Jizhou, the author of Zhenzhou Dacheng, I arrived in a place called Jian Daang, which is in Fujian province. And the mother of somebody, Tang Keshan, had inability to raise her arms. So, the thing is that women in those days, it generally weren't referred to by name by outside people. So you'll see cases with the sister, the daughter, the wife, the mother of such and such a guy. That's how they referred to women back then. I guess it was considered polite. It would be considered too informal to call them by their name if you weren't family, I guess. Anyway, so somebody, Tung Kashan, I don't know who he was, but his mother couldn't raise her arms. She had aversion to cold on her upper back, and her body felt really tired. Although it was summertime and very hot, she still wore a padded jacket to keep her warm, a quilted jacket. Various doctors had thought she must have yang deficiency or deficiency cold. So Yang Jizhou, I examined her pulse and found it was deep and slippery, not deficient. This was phlegm in the channels, in the Jing Wo, the channels in the wool vessels. This was phlegm that made her arms like heavy and tired, made her tired, not deficiency. So I needled UB13, LI11, and stomach 36. So that would be 6 needles, okay? 3.6 needles. That same day, she immediately felt her body get lighter and she could raise her arms. She no longer feared cold and she stopped wearing her padded jacket. Afterwards, he gave her a formula to eliminate damp and transform phlegm. So Yang Jizhou actually practiced acupuncture, moxa, herbs, everything. He practiced everything. But he wrote a book about acupuncture because he thought that there was not a good enough book available. But throughout Zhenzhou Dacheng, there are lots of times when he uses herbs or suggests herbs or talks about herbs. So anyway, he did the acupuncture to clear out her channels, and then he gave her a formula to eliminate damp and transform phlegm to treat the root. And until today, whenever he wrote that, she is still healthy and no other diseases have occurred. If I had mistaken this for yang deficiency with coldness, the more I supplemented her, the more it would have increased the phlegm, and then she would have been even more, stuck and stagnant, so forth. One has to be careful, he says. Okay, but the point of this for this particular video is, look, only 6 needles. And he got good results, it seems. So, besides fewer needles and thicker needles, they also had shallower insertion than we tend to do today. So, for example, CAM, Chinese Acupuncture and Max Sebastian, is one of the main textbooks we use. And for each point, it gives needling depth. Okay. But also, Zhenzhou Dacheng talks about needling depth. And so if we compare the two, these are just a random sampling of points. I didn't make a whole table with all of the points, but this is consistently true. Look, lung 1 is needled 3/10 of a cun deep in Zhenzhou Dacheng, but it's a half to 0.8 cun in CAM. Lung 5, 3/10 of a cun deep again. But in CAM, 1/2 to 1 cun deep. Okay, and so I could read all of these. The first 4 are 3/10 of a cun deep, and we see, stomach 44 starts with 3/10 of a cun, but goes up to half a cun. And LI4 goes to 1 cun deep. Okay, and then let's try a deeper one. 4/10 of a cun deep for spleen 4, and that's 0.5 to 0.8, or spleen 9, half a cun deep, but you could needle it in CAM up to 1 cun deep. This is consistently for all points. The deepest needling depth in Zhenzhou Dacheng is 0.8 of a cun deep. None of the points say to needle 1 cun deep in Zhenzhou Dacheng. So they're using thicker needles, but they're not needling as deeply. Also, then needle retention is an issue. They're like in modern times, pretty much everyone I know has a patient lie down with the needles in for 15, 20, half hour, even sometimes longer. But in ancient texts from, the last, like from the Ming and Qing dynasty, all the way back to the Han dynasty, when they talk about needling depth, needling retention, most often it's given in terms of exhalations. So, of course, 5 exhalations means 5 inhalations and exhalations, but they just call it 5 exhalations. That's how long lung 1 is needled, or lung 5, 3 exhalations. A long needle retention, stomach 44, 10 exhalations. So, these are exhalations of the doctor, because the patient maybe have rapid breathing or some other problem, and we're assuming the doctor is like calm and healthy, and so the doctor's breaths will be more appropriate. And so to me, finding this was really fascinating. I just thought acupuncture needles need to be retained for a very long time. Retention is not given in minutes. And then you think about it, it makes sense because they didn't have clocks. So, to say to retain it for 10 minutes, but what would that mean to somebody in ancient times who didn't have a clock with any kind of accuracy? Sure, maybe they had a sundial, but that's not going to have the accuracy. So, in terms of cooking herbs or whatever, they had other ways of talking about time. And so for needle retention, it was almost always about how many breaths. So this is really short compared to today. So let's put some of this together. Okay. If needle retention is given in breaths, that also implies that one needle is inserted at a time, because if I insert a needle and I'm counting the breaths for that needle, I can't also be inserting another needle. I'd lose track of the breaths. So I'd insert the needle and take 1, 2, 3 exhalations, and then I'd remove the needle. Of course, probably I'd be breathing slower. Like I feel like, oh, it's boring for you to listen to me breathe. So, I'm probably breathing faster while demonstrating for you. But you can see that you would need to insert the needle, breathe the breaths while you're counting them, and then take the needle out and move on to the next point. In addition, I believe they probably held on to the needle while they were doing the breathing, because it's got a thick handle, so it's heavy and it's not inserted very deeply. And therefore, if it's heavy and not very deep, it's going to tip over very easily and not stand up the way you want. So they're probably inserting it, manipulating it, getting chi, supplementing or draining, and then taking 3 breaths or 5 breaths or however many breaths while they're holding on to the needle. And in some ways that makes sense. It's like you're almost doing qigong while you're holding on to the needle. And then they'd remove it and go on to the next point. So they'd have full focus on that needle and their breathing while it's inserted. It's pretty likely that the doctor's going to reuse the same needle on all of the points, unless you need a longer needle for a certain point or a special needle for a certain point. So we're not going to do that today because of clean needle technique, but they didn't have clean needle technique back then. So, that's what they did. Of course, if we were going to use these techniques today, we would use a new needle each time, but we could still do the thicker needle, shallower insertion, the breaths while we're holding on to the needle, then open a new needle to put in the next point. So with fewer insertions and shorter retentions, a treatment would take much less time than today, but it would demand your full attention. And so we're going to have to manage patient expectations if they're used to long needle retention, if you want to try this out. But you can see long needle retention is not necessary, because I do believe the ancients were effective in many of their acupuncture treatments with this style of practice. So, I've heard people say, oh, the needles have to be retained for 28 minutes and 48 seconds, which is absolutely ridiculous because they don't have clocks. So how are they even going to tell about seconds? Well, of course, you could round it up to 30 minutes, but still they don't have clocks. And if they're using shallow insertion with heavier needles, it's going to be harder to, like retain the needles for that long. Anyway, here's somebody arguing for that. Here's the web page I got this from. In the Ling Shu spiritual pivot, it is believed that the body's energy, I hate the word energy, it's qi, that the body's energy and blood is circulated through the channels 50 times a day. 24 hours equals 1,440 minutes, which is then divided by 50. That results in 28 minutes and 48 seconds. So for practitioners who subscribe to this approach, these guidelines suggest an acupuncture needle retention time of approximately 30 minutes. Okay, so this is making it sound like Ling Shu says to do this. Ling Shu does not say to do this. So let's examine, this issue. Ling Shu chapter 5 talks about 50 circulations in a day. It's also mentioned in Nanjing chapter 1, and there are other places within Neijing and Nanjing where it mentions 50 circulations of qi in a day. But those passages never say, therefore, retain the needles for a certain amount of time. Okay, so the 50 circulations of day is correct, but that's not the take-home message of 50 circulations. This, therefore, seems to be added by relatively modern people, because it's not in any of the books in the Ming or Qing dynasty or whatever. I'm guessing that 20th century European practitioners came up with it. None of this is in the standard acupuncture manuals. And they only talk about retention in terms of breaths or a few other things that, occasionally it might say, I don't know, the time it takes to burn a stick of incense, but like that's extremely rare. Okay. So if you like the idea, go ahead and do it. I don't have any problem with you practicing in a way that makes sense for you and that does good for your patients. But what I have a problem is for people to say, Ling Shu says that you need to retain the needle for 28 minutes and 48 seconds. It does not say that. It just doesn't. That's crazy. Okay. So truth in advertising, that's all I ask. There's another argument for 15 to 20-minute needle retention coming from the same source. And, you hear people talk about this kind of stuff. So this person says, according to the Nanjing, it's the circulation of blood and balance of energies, which are focused on the total length of the body's meridians and collaterals, is believed to be 1,620 tsun long. Energy, which means qi, is believed to move through the body's meridians at a rate of 6 tsun for each inhalation and exhalation. And therefore, 620 divided by 6 equals 270 breaths, which allows for the energy to make its way fully through the body. What they're trying to do is have the qi make one full circulation out of the 50 or out of the, however you're determining what one full circulation of qi through all the channels. Anyway, so if somebody breathes 14 times a minute, it would take 20 minutes to complete a cycle. If they breathe 18 times a minute, it requires 15 minutes. Therefore, 15 to 20 minutes is recommended in some cases. So this calculation, they're saying that the channels, and actually this is the channels, this is the Jing, this is not the Wo. The passage doesn't talk about the Wo vessels. And let's see what the passage actually talks about. Nanjing chapter 1 says that the movement in what they call the vessels and breath, as stated on the previous slide, 6 tsun for each inhalation and exhalation. It moves 3 cun, Qi moves 3 cun for each inhalation and 3 more cun for each exhalation. So that's 6 cun per breath. However, that section of Nanjing is talking about pulse, is not even talking about the channels, it's talking about pulse. And it never says, therefore, needle retention should be some certain amount of time. The 23rd difficulty discusses the length of the vessels. So here, vessels is really referring to what we call channels. But it doesn't discuss needle retention either. This sum of 1620 is in the 23rd difficulty, but it also includes yin chow and yang chow vessel, not just the 12 main channels. So it seems like people who are thinking this are, if we talk about the circulation of qi, we're talking about that in the 12 channels. So lung to large intestine to stomach to spleen and so forth until you get to liver and then back to lungs. And yin chow and yang chow are not part of it. So we should subtract their length from the number 1620 if we want to talk about circulate one cycle through the main channels. And this doesn't mention anything about needle retention either. So they're taking 6 cun per breath from Nanjing chapter 1. They're taking 620 cun from the 23rd difficulty for the length of all the channels, including yin chow and yang chow. They're putting those two things together and then saying, therefore, retain the needles this long. That is just nowhere, that conclusion doesn't come from any old book. Nanjing does have a section on needling, so you might think it would talk about needle retention there, but it does not specify the length of needle retention. So, Lingshu and Nanjing and Suwen don't talk about length of needle retention. They might occasionally talk about inserting the needle and retaining it for 3 breaths or whatever, but they don't go over the points one by one, and they don't have statements on needle retention, except that Lingshu says long needle retention is warming and short needle retention is heat clearing, but it doesn't define what is long and what is short needle retention. So where did this idea of the qi needing to circulate one full circuit for treatment to become effective, where did that come from? For example, if I have shoulder pain and I want to use Li4 and Li15 to treat the shoulder pain, the qi only needs to go from Li4 to the shoulder. It doesn't need to circulate one full cycle. If I have spleen deficiency, the qi only needs to get from stomach 36 to the spleen. Why does it need to circulate through the whole body? I mean, maybe there's some conditions where you might think, oh, it would be great to, get the qi flowing everywhere. There might be some conditions, but most of the time we're treating something specific and we don't need to circulate it through the whole body. And again, how could they have measured time so precisely without clocks? So there are a couple instances of long needle retention in ancient books, but it's not going to be like, 28 minutes and 48 seconds or 15 to 20 minutes based on this. Almost always it's the number of breaths. So again, if you want to do that, fine. But the thing that bothers me is when people say this is what Lingshu says or this is what Nanjing says, because it's just not. So the final part of this video, I want to talk about how ancients gave full attention to each insertion. And so if you're only going to insert 5 needles, you can take the time to really focus on each insertion and give your full intention and your full intent to each insertion. And if you're trying to put in 20 needles, then you have to hurry if you want to keep up with your schedule. So you're not able to give as much focus. And I do believe intent matters. So from Ling Shu, which is about 2,000 years old, up to Zhenzhou Dachang, and even up until today, many books tell us we need to focus our intent while we're needling. They don't always phrase it this way, but we're going to see some passages from Neijing. And as I said, it's hard to give full intent if you're inserting so many needles, but with fewer insertions, you can have better focus on each one. And that focus could make up for fewer needles, shallower insertion, and shorter retention. Besides, whoever said more needles are better, that's like Western thought, supersize it, give me extra, give me more is better. That's Western thought. East Asian thought would be more based on elegant simplicity. So this is something to consider. What I suggest is you experiment with it and play with it and see if you get, different results, or maybe this way is appropriate for certain patients, but not appropriate for everyone. So let me know what you think, but let's talk about intent. For example, Ling Shu chapter 9 says that when you're going to treat a patient, occupy a quiet, secluded space. Divine the coming and going of the spirit, your spirit, the patient's spirit, the spirit in the room. Close the doors and fill in the windows. Don't let the hun and po scatter. So this could literally mean close the door and fill in the windows so you don't hear the sounds of people outside, but it also could mean kind of close off your senses to what's going on around you. Focus intent and unify the spirit with undivided jingqi. Do not listen to human sounds. Together, essence, you must unify the spirit and command your will or your mind, depending on how you want to translate that word, to be present in the needle. You want your will or mind to be present in the needle. It's focusing intent. Ling Shu chapter 1 says, the Tao of the needle, or the Tao of acupuncture, is to hold it firmly as if it were a treasure. Insert the needle straight in, which probably means perpendicular. Well, we don't always do that, but don't deviate to the left or right. At least get your point location right and have the needle right in the channel and right in the point. Your spirit should be focused on an autumn hair, directing your intent to the patient. Okay, so an autumn hair, animals in autumn, they start growing in fine hair in their undercoat. Like they have the regular hair on the outside, but they have more fine hair underneath to help keep them warm. So that's like an autumn hair. It's so fine and so thin. And so that's referring to, the needle is as fine as an autumn hair, or that's referring to the point itself, as focused as, the tip of an autumn hair at the point, directing your intent. So then Suen chapter 25, and there's a bunch more of that, these kind of quotes, and they're later quotes too. I just am not, this is already long enough. I'm just not gonna go on forever about intent. I think I have a video someplace else about intent you could look for. Anyway, you must needle as if you were approaching a deep abyss. Your hand should be like it's holding a tiger. So, if you're standing on the edge of a deep abyss, you would have full concentration so you don't fall off. If you're holding a tiger, you have to have full focus and concentration, or the tiger's going to bite you. I mean, that's even true with my cat. If I'm trying to give it medicine or something, you have to have full focus. So these are in Suen chapter 25, and then Suen chapter 54 has like these same sentences plus additional sentence and commentary. So, you must needle as if you're approaching a deep abyss. Don't dare to stumble. And it says, on the occasion of moving the needle, you should be respectful and careful like this. then your hand like it's holding a tiger. A commentary in Su 154 adds, desiring the strength of your hand that you need to hold the tiger, manage the needle like holding a tiger, desire the firmness and have strength. Suen chapter 25. Your spirit, should not be contemplating the numerous things. So your spirit should be focused and not thinking about everything else. Observe the patient with a quiet mind without looking to left or right. So don't be distracted by this and that. Okay. And so these are some of the quotes from Neijing about intent. And I'm going to close with a story I came across from a Qing Dynasty book, although I think the story comes from an earlier time. This story reminds me of focusing intent during needle insertion and manipulation. So, here's the book's information. Let's see the story. It's totally unrelated to acupuncture, but I think the take-home message can be applied. So the story goes, there's a record of a dice incantation in an older book. Okay, so, if you're a gambler and you're playing with dice, there's an incantation to help you win. And so it's something like, Edi Midi, Mije, Wodi. That's in Mandarin. And of course, in ancient times, they weren't speaking modern Mandarin. So the pronunciation is probably a little bit different. The words of the incantation don't make normal sense, so we can't just translate them. I really don't know what the incantation means. But some Chinese incantations, whether they were Buddhist or not Buddhist, some of them are transliterations of something in Sanskrit. They're taking Sanskrit sounds and parts of mantras and stuff like that. So anyway, that's the dice mantra. When you recite it 100,000 times, all 6 dice will comply with your call and will turn the way you want. Okay, so apparently there are dice games that involve 6 dice. And if you, chant this 10,000 times, not while you're playing, but, this is like your practice. If you chant this 100,000 times, then you can make the dice do what you want. So it goes on to say, some people have tried to confirm that it works and some don't. I, the author of this, say this is like reciting the word donkey to treat disease. And what that is referring to is that, we could use a little medical magic. And if you don't even have a jiao or you don't want to use a jiao, maybe if you have done enough work on your focus, you could say donkey, donkey, donkey. You could chant donkey and get the effects of Jiao. Well, I'm not saying that's true, but that's what he's saying. Generally speaking, when something is gathered by Jingshen, by your consciousness, the qi mechanism responds to it, the qi. Once the qi mechanism resonates, ghosts and spirits will pass it into being. This is the meaning of the saying, completely seeing something as reality can even crack open metal and stone. Okay, so what this is saying is that if you, faithfully recite the word donkey, then ghosts and spirits can, pass it into being as Jiao. And completely seeing something as reality can even crack open metal and stone. So if you just visualize metal and stone cracking open and you really see that as that it's already happened, he's saying you can do that. I do have a little translation note somewhere in here is the word chung. And we'll see it again on the next slide. And that usually means sincerity, but if you look it up, in a big old dictionary, it can mean conforming to reality. That's what this is. So sincerely seeing it as already real. And so earnestly believing it, one sees it as already real. When it's seen as real, it will be set in motion. So think about this when you're needling. Back to my example of shoulder pain. If you see the blockage, because pain is always a blockage, right? When there's free flow, there's no pain. When there's pain, there's not free flow. So if you see the blockage already burst open, you see that while you're needling and you earnestly, you know, your intent is earnestly there, and even you're not just seeing it happening in the future, but you're seeing it as already happening, then it will be set in motion. I think that's pretty profound for us to play with when we're needling. When somebody tentatively tries it without really seeing it as real, and when they don't see it as real, it's not set into motion. So that's why I'm saying that dice incantation worked for some people and didn't work for others. The people it worked for believed that it happened, and the people who didn't work for were still like wondering, could this have happened? Could this be real? So anyone who persists in refining a skill must be like this. It's not only for this incantation. He's saying we can apply this use of the mind for other things, such as needling. So I think this is pretty amazing. And I think this is a good practice that when you're needling, see the spleen is already filled with chi. See the blockage is already, unobstructed and free flow in that region. See at the moment that you're needling. You know, a long time ago, I worked, my clinic practice was with people with HIV and AIDS, and many of them were taking medications which they hated the idea of taking them, but they also felt, like they needed to. They were afraid if they didn't take them. And what I would tell them is like, if you're going to take them, view them as an elixir of the gods, while you're swallowing them. Don't view them as poison, but you have to do it. View it as an elixir of the gods. I think our minds are so powerful. So, I wouldn't say this in front of a room full of MDs, but I do think acupuncture has magic to it. But the magic comes from something between our heart and our hands. And so I hope this is useful for you. I have another thing about another video about moxa and bleeding in the old books, and I'll have another one about point functions and point indications. Okay, so that's it for now.